Zena was a 17-year-old girl with big dreams. She loved singing and hoped to join a music competition someday. One evening, her boyfriend, Tund, invited her to a party. Tund was popular in their neighborhood and always knew the latest trends. "It will be fun, Zena," he said with his charming smile. At first, Zena hesitated. Her mother didn't like her staying out late, but Tund promised, "I'll bring you home safely." Trusting him, Zena agreed. That evening, Zena wore her favorite yellow dress and braided her hair neatly. Tund arrived looking sharp in his blue jeans and white shirt. He carried himself with confidence, and Zena couldn't help but feel proud walking beside him. As they left, Zena's mother called out, "Be careful, my daughter. The night holds secrets." Zena laughed, thinking her mother was just being overprotective. The party was held in an unfinished house at the edge of the neighborhood. The walls were bare, and the floors were dusty, but the organizers had decorated the place with colorful lights. Zena was amazed by the loud music, the people dancing, and the smell of grilled meat. It was her first real party, and she felt grown up. As they walked in, Tund greeted his friends, who were all older boys. They gave him fist bumps and looked at Zena with interest. "This your babe?" one of them asked with a sly grin. Tund laughed and nodded. Zena felt shy but smiled politely. She didn't know these boys well, but she trusted Tund to keep her safe. At first, the party was fun. Zena and Tund danced together, and she loved how free she felt, swaying to the music. Someone handed her a drink, and she hesitated. "It's just juice," Tund said, winking at her. She sipped it slowly, but the taste was bitter and strange. She decided not to finish it. As the night went on, Zena noticed that Tund kept stepping away to talk to people. Sometimes, they spoke in low voices, glancing around nervously. When she asked him what was going on, he smiled and said, "Don't worry about it. Just enjoy yourself." But Zena couldn't shake the uneasy feeling building in her chest. Around midnight, the music stopped suddenly, and everyone turned to look at the back of the room. Two boys were arguing loudly, their voices angry and sharp. Tund was standing nearby, trying to calm them down. Zena felt her heart race as she saw one of the boys pull something shiny from his pocket. It was a knife. "Stay here," Tund told her, his face serious. Zena didn't know what to do. She wanted to follow him, but her legs felt heavy. The room grew tense, and people started whispering. Some moved closer to see what was happening, while others backed away, sensing danger. Suddenly, there was a loud bang. It wasn't the sound of a knife, it was a gunshot. People screamed and ran in all directions. Zena ducked behind a table, her hands trembling. She tried to see where Tund was, but couldn't find him in the chaos. The room filled with smoke, and her chest tightened with fear. The sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. Someone must have called them. Zena felt a hand grab her arm, and she jumped, ready to scream. But it was Tund. "We have to go, now," he shouted, pulling her towards the back door. Outside, the air was cold and still. Tund led Zena through narrow alleys, his grip tight on her wrist. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Don't ask questions," he replied, looking over his shoulder. Zena's mind raced. She trusted Tund, but something about his behavior scared her. When they finally stopped, Zena saw that they were behind an old warehouse. Tund's friends were there, talking in hushed voices. One of them was bleeding from his arm. Zena realized with horror that they had been involved in whatever happened at the party. She stepped back, her heart pounding. Zena's legs felt weak as she leaned against the wall of the warehouse. The night's events were spinning in her mind. She looked at Tund, who was pacing back and forth, talking to his friends in low tones. "Tund," she called softly, her voice trembling, "what's going on? Who got hurt?" Tund avoided her eyes and said, "It's nothing, Zena. Just stay quiet, and I'll explain later." Zena wasn't convinced. She could see the fear in his eyes and the blood on one of the boys' shirts. The injured boy winced as another tried to wrap his arm with a cloth. Zina wanted to run, but they were in the middle of nowhere. Her heart ached with regret for coming to the party. She thought of her mother's warning and wished she'd listened. Suddenly, the sound of police sirens grew louder, cutting through the night. The boys panicked, scattering in different directions. "Zina, come with me," Tund shouted, grabbing her hand. But Zina hesitated. She didn't want to get involved in whatever trouble they were in. "I can't, Tund," she said, pulling her hand away. "I need to go home." Tund looked at her, his face full of desperation. "If you stay here, the police will find you. They won't believe you had nothing to do with this," he said. Zina's mind raced. She felt trapped between staying with Tund and facing the unknown consequences, or running and risking everything on her own. Zina made a split-second decision to run. She turned and bolted towards the street, ignoring Tund's shouts behind her. Her bare feet slapped against the cold pavement as she sprinted through the quiet neighborhood. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away from the chaos. The sirens were closer now, and flashing blue and red lights lit up the dark streets. Zina ducked behind a parked car, trying to catch her breath. Her chest heaved, and her heart pounded like a drum. She prayed silently, asking for protection and a way out of this nightmare. As Zina peeked from behind the car, she saw a police van stop near the warehouse. Officers got out, shouting commands as they approached the building. Zina felt a pang of guilt for leaving Tund behind, but she reminded herself that she had no part in what happened. Her only goal now was to get home safely. She crept along the shadows, careful not to make any noise. Her yellow dress, once her favorite, was now dusty and torn from running through the rough streets. She thought about her mother's worried face and felt tears sting her eyes. "Please, let me get home," she whispered to herself. After what felt like hours, Zina finally recognized a familiar street. Relief washed over her as she saw the small shop near her house. But just as she was about to cross the road, a car pulled up beside her. The windows rolled down, and to her shock, Tund was in the passenger seat. "Get in, Zina," he said urgently. Zina froze, her instinct screaming at her to run. The driver, one of Tund's older friends, glared at her. "You can't stay out here," Tund said, his voice softer. "The police are looking for everyone who was at the party." Zina hesitated, her fear battling with her trust in Tund. Against her better judgment, Zina climbed into the car. The ride was tense and silent. Tund kept looking out the window, and the driver gripped the wheel tightly, his jaw clenched. "Where are we going?" Zina asked quietly. Tund didn't answer. Instead, the driver muttered, "We just need to lay low for a while." Zina's stomach churned. She didn't like the sound of that. She felt trapped, sitting between two people she didn't fully trust. The car sped through empty streets, and Zina's heart sank as they moved farther from her neighborhood. She realized she might have made a terrible mistake. Zina sat silently in the back seat, clutching her torn dress as the car sped through the quiet streets. Her mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. The sound of the party, the shouts, and the panic all felt like a terrible dream. "Where are we going?" she asked again, her voice shaky. Tund finally turned to her, his face filled with worry. "Zina, just trust me," he said, but his tone didn't feel convincing. The driver shot Tund an angry glance. "You brought her into this mess. She better not talk to anyone," he snapped. Zina's heart sank. She realized she was in much deeper trouble than she thought. The car eventually pulled into a secluded area, surrounded by tall trees. The driver killed the engine and stepped out, motioning for them to follow. Zina hesitated but reluctantly got out of the car. The air was cold, and the night felt darker than ever. "Why are we here?" she asked, her voice trembling. The driver ignored her, walking ahead toward a small, abandoned building. Tund stayed close to Zina, whispering, "We need to hide until things cool down." Zina shook her head. "I didn't do anything. I just want to go home," she cried. Tund grabbed her arm gently. Zina, please. If you leave now, they'll think you're part of it. Inside the abandoned building, Zina sat on a dusty floor while Tund and the driver talked in hushed tones. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling more alone than ever. The driver occasionally glanced at her, his gaze sharp and suspicious. Zina felt like an outsider, caught in a situation she didn't belong in. Her thoughts drifted to her mother, who was probably awake and worried sick. Zina wanted to scream, to run, but fear kept her frozen. She couldn't understand how a night that had started with so much excitement had turned into a nightmare. Tears streamed down her face as regret weighed heavily on her heart. Morning came slowly, and the first rays of sunlight filtered through the broken windows. Zina hadn't slept at all, her mind too restless. Tund sat beside her, his head in his hands. I'm sorry, he finally said. I never wanted this to happen. Zina looked at him, anger and sadness mixing in her chest. Then why did you bring me? She asked softly. Tund sighed, struggling to find the words. I thought it would be fun. I didn't think it would get this bad, he admitted. Zina shook her head. This isn't fun. This is dangerous, Tund. I just want to go home, she said firmly. Tund nodded, but deep down, Zina wasn't sure if she could trust him anymore. As they sat in silence, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. Zina's heart leapt in fear. The driver motioned for everyone to be quiet, grabbing a metal rod for protection. Stay back, he whispered, his eyes scanning the door. Zina clung to Tund, her body trembling. The footsteps stopped, and a loud knock broke the silence. Open up! Police, a voice shouted. Zina's stomach dropped. The driver cursed under his breath, gesturing for them to hide. Tund pulled Zina behind an old cabinet, their breaths shallow as the knocks grew louder. Zina closed her eyes, praying they wouldn't be found. The police didn't wait long before forcing their way inside. The door creaked as it swung open, and heavy boots stomped across the dusty floor. Zina held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it would give them away. Search the place, one of the officers commanded. The sound of furniture being moved and objects being knocked over filled the room. Zina felt tears streaming down her face as fear gripped her. She wondered if this was the end for her. Would they arrest her? Would her mother ever forgive her for getting into this mess? The police eventually left, seemingly satisfied that no one was inside. Zina and Tund emerged from their hiding spot, shaken but relieved. The driver peeked out the window, muttering, "They'll be back. We need to move." Zina shook her head. "No, I'm not going anywhere. I'm done running," she said firmly. Tund looked at her with wide eyes. "Zina, you can't stay here. It's not safe," he pleaded. But Zina was resolute. "I didn't do anything wrong, Tund. I'm not like you and your friends. I'll explain everything to the police if I have to," she said. Her words left Tund speechless. Ignoring their protests, Zina walked out of the building, her steps steady despite her fear. She didn't know where she was going, but she was determined to find her way home. The sunlight felt warm on her skin, a stark contrast to the cold fear she had felt all night. Tund watched her go, torn between following her and staying with his friends. "You're making a mistake, Zina," he called out. But Zina didn't look back. She had made up her mind. She was done with the lies, the danger, and the regret. All she wanted was to return to her mother and the safety of her home. Zina walked quickly through the dense bushes, unsure of her direction but desperate to get away from the nightmare she had been trapped in. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made her jump. The fear of being caught by either the police or Tund's friends pushed her forward. The rising sun bathed the area in light, but her heart was still heavy with fear and regret. As she walked, Zina thought about her mother. She remembered how her mom always warned her to be careful about the people she trusted. "A good name is better than riches," her mother would say. Zina wiped a tear from her cheek. If only she had listened. She whispered softly, "Please, God, help me find my way home." After what felt like hours of walking, Zina stumbled upon a narrow dirt road. Her heart lifted slightly, hoping it would lead her back to her village. Her feet ached, and her dress was torn and dirty, but she didn't care. She just wanted to be home. As she followed the road, the sound of a vehicle approached from behind. Panic surged through her. Was it the police? Or worse, the driver? She quickly hid behind a tree, her breathing shallow. A rusty pickup truck passed by, the driver oblivious to her presence. Relieved, Zina stepped back onto the road, determined to keep moving. Back in the village, Zina's mother paced the floor of their small home, her heart filled with worry. She had stayed up all night, waiting for Zina to return. Where could she be? She whispered, staring at the front door. Neighbors had come by earlier, offering to help look for her, but no one had found any sign of her. Zina's mother sank into a chair, clutching a small piece of fabric from Zina's dress that she had found on the ground near the market. "Please, bring my daughter back to me," she prayed aloud, tears streaming down her face. The village had begun to stir, and word of Zina's disappearance spread quickly. As Zina followed the road, she spotted a small hut in the distance. Smoke curled from the roof, and the smell of burning firewood filled the air. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since the previous evening. She hesitated, unsure if it was safe to approach. A kind-looking elderly woman emerged from the hut, carrying a basket of vegetables. She noticed Zina standing by the road and called out, "My child, are you lost?" Zina hesitated but nodded, tears filling her eyes. The woman waved her over, her gentle smile providing a sliver of comfort. "Come in. Let's get you something to eat," she said. Inside the hut, Zina sat near the fire while the woman prepared a simple meal. The aroma of the steaming porridge filled the room, making Zina's stomach rumble louder. "Eat, my dear," the woman said, placing a bowl in front of her. Zina mumbled a quiet, "Thank you," before digging in. As Zina ate, the woman sat beside her, studying her face. "You've had a long night," she said softly. Zina nodded but didn't offer any details. The woman didn't press her, sensing that the girl needed time to gather her thoughts. "You're safe here. When you're ready, you can tell me what happened," the woman added. After resting for a while, Zina finally opened up to the elderly woman. She explained how she had followed Tun to the party, the chaos that unfolded, and her desperate attempt to return home. The woman listened quietly, her face filled with understanding and concern. "You're lucky, my child," the woman said when Zina finished. "Not everyone comes back from such situations unharmed." Zina nodded, guilt washing over her. "I just want to go home," she whispered. The woman patted her hand gently. "You will. I'll help you," she promised. The woman offered Zina fresh clothes to replace her torn dress. "These belong to my granddaughter," she said, handing Zina a simple but clean outfit. Zina thanked her, feeling a small sense of relief as she changed into the clothes. As they prepared to leave, the woman packed a small bundle of food for Zina. "You'll need this for the journey," she said. Zina felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you, Ma. I don't know how to repay you," she said. The woman smiled warmly. "Just promise me you'll be more careful in the future," she replied. The woman led Zina to a nearby path that connected to the main village road. "Follow this, and you'll find your way home," she instructed. Zina hesitated, turning back to hug the woman tightly. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice trembling. As Zina began her journey back, she felt a mix of emotions. Relief that she was closer to home, but fear of facing her mother's anger and disappointment. She knew she had to take responsibility for her actions, but the thought of seeing her mother again gave her the strength to keep going. When Zina finally reached the outskirts of her village, she paused, taking a deep breath. She could see the familiar rooftops in the distance. Her heart raced as she thought about how her mother would react. Would she be angry? Relieved? Zina didn't know what to expect. As she walked through the village, curious eyes followed her. Whispers spread quickly, "She's back." Where has she been? Zina ignored the murmurs, focusing on getting home. Her feet felt heavy, but her determination to face the truth pushed her forward. Zina's mother was sitting outside their home when she saw her daughter approaching. She froze for a moment, then ran to Zina, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Zina, where have you been?" "I was so worried," she cried. Tears streamed down both their faces as Zina apologized over and over. "I'm so sorry, Mama. I should have listened to you," Zina sobbed. Her mother held her close, her relief outweighing her anger. "You're home now, and that's what matters," she said softly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zina felt safe. She vowed never to let her curiosity or bad decisions lead her astray again,